Welcome to Kentucky Wide, a podcast production of the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm Sarah Jemerson.
And I'm Mick Sullivan. We are your hosts for this fourth episode of Kentucky Wide. This episode was written by our colleague, Jason Berkowitz. And over the next 25 minutes or so, you're going to hear all about two Kentucky giants, men of the 19th century who were both nearly 8 feet tall.
First up is Jim Porter, the man who grew up in Portland near Louisville and who became quite famous in his day. He even hosted Charles Dickens, the British author of A Christmas Carol fame.
Then you will meet Martin Van Buren Bates, a Letcher County native who, despite being 7 feet 8 inches tall, fell in love and married a woman who was even taller than he was.
Speaking of big, we hope to see you sometime soon at the Fraser History Museum in downtown Louisville, where we've got 3 floors filled with great exhibits dedicated to Kentucky history.
This podcast is just one of many ways we share the stories of people and places of our Commonwealth. So let's get started.
In January of 1842, English novelist Charles Dickens arrived in America. Not yet 30, Dickens had already become a bit of a celebrity himself, having just written The Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist, both of which the public adored. His plans were simple: tour the U.S. for several months, meeting with a who's who list of American movers and shakers. Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, former President John Quincy Adams, then current President John Tyler, and even Kentucky's own Henry Clay. Dickens met with them all, writing of his experiences in his book American Notes, published later that year. The city of Louisville, conveniently on the Ohio River, was one of his many stops. Dickens arrived at the wharf by steamboat around midnight. He would spend his lone night in Louisville at the now historic Galt House, built just 7 years previous. The next morning, Dickens insisted on meeting the city's most noticeable citizen, Jim Porter, who the author had been told was the tallest man in the world. He sent his request, summoning the Kentucky giant to the Galt House. Standing at 7 feet 8 inches, Jim Porter was used to attention, and world-famous British authors were really no different from anyone else in his eyes. Charles Dickens wanted to meet Jim Porter more than Jim Porter wanted to meet Charles Dickens. So Porter sent a message back saying that if the meeting was this important to Dickens, then he was welcome to come to Jim Porter for a visit. Undaunted and eager to meet the Kentucky giant, Charles Dickens hopped into a carriage and traveled the muddy streets to Portland, just west of downtown Louisville. Some of the details of the encounter between the two men were included in American Notes, the book Dickens published in the months after his circuitous visit. He observed that Porter seemed to have a weakness in the region of his knees and a truthfulness in his long face. He was also taken aback by Porter's weapon, affectionately referred to as his little rifle, though it was as tall as Porter. Following their short conversation, Porter took his leave, with Dickens describing the departing giant as bobbing down the cabin among men of 6 feet and upwards, like a lighthouse among lampposts. When Jim Porter had the chance to describe Dickens, however, he was less poetic, simply saying the author looked like a riverboat gambler. Nevertheless, as much as Dickens had been amazed by Jim Porter, the city of Louisville had made a rather poor impression. In American Notes, he described the city's buildings as smoky and blackened, and the local police station as nothing but a little lazy, good-for-nothing front parlor open to the street. And of the road his carriage had taken to meet Porter, Dickens said that it had been perfectly alive with pigs of all ages lying about in all directions. Perhaps the author of A Christmas Carol had a bit more Scrooge in him than previously thought. Porter and Dickens were born just a few months apart. The future Kentucky giant beat Charles into the world on December 15, 1811. Though born in Portsmouth, Ohio, Jim's family would move to Shippingport at the Falls of the Ohio soon after, with parents John and Sarah relocating to the up-and-coming settlement in search of employment. During this time, Shippingport, just beyond Louisville and Portland, was a whirlwind of hustle and bustle. As Kentucky's busiest port, It was home to distilleries, mills, and racetracks, steamboats at all hours, and a population on the rise. Indeed, Shippingport's population increased a staggering 500% from the years 1810 to 1820, presenting opportunities for men and women of every size to make their way in the world. Jim's father quickly found employment at the Tarascon Mill, a 6-story flour mill that mirrored the vibrant energy of the settlement at large. As for young Jim, you may be surprised to learn that he was a rather small child. So small, in fact, that he was first employed as a jockey, racing horses at the Elm Tree Garden track. That said, his short stature would be short-lived. As a teenager, Jim Porter began to grow, and grow, and grow some more. Was it our world-famous limestone water? Or maybe a healthy Kentucky diet of Benedictine, burgoo, and bourbon balls? Unfortunately, we know this is not the case, as scientists agree his condition was likely caused by acromegaly, an overabundance of growth hormone. Of course, this unusual spurt did not go unnoticed by the citizens of Shippingport. How could it? Jim was growing as much as an inch a week, and Kentucky being Kentucky, you can bet your bottom dollar such spectacle did not go to waste. Far from it. Locals gathered on Saturday nights to weigh and measure this marvel of a man, sprouting by the minute on the banks of the Ohio. By age 20, Jim Porter had become Big Jim Porter, and not long after, the Kentucky Giant. Now 7 feet 8 inches in height, though some would argue he was even taller. Hands measuring 13 inches from wrist to middle finger. If he was so inclined, such a man could make a special way in the world, and Jim would certainly find his place. At first, Porter worked as a cooper's apprentice, learning how to build the wooden casks and barrels commonly transported down the Ohio River. However, he quickly became frustrated. His gangly and ever-growing limbs made his efforts clumsy. Discouraged, yet undeterred, Porter pivoted to making hogsheads. This was logical, as they are simply larger barrels used for tobacco transport. However, he soon realized that barrel making of any size would never be his calling. Jim then turned to driving a carriage, transporting his fare up and down the Portland and Louisville Turnpike. Here, he rarely had to get out of his seat, needing only to lean over and extend his long arm to let out his passengers. It was said that almost any day he could be seen driving on Main Street in his one-seat buggy, a big mule pulling it, and his knees higher than the dashboard. But the opportunity of a world outside of Shippingport presented itself. Traveling theater shows were common in the 19th century. Acting troupes would travel from city to city, often by boat, sell some tickets, run a few performances, and move on to the next town. Now an actor, Jim Porter found himself touring the region as who else but Gulliver, in a production of Gulliver's Travels. Of course, life on the road can be difficult, no matter your size. But Porter would find trouble others did not during his time as an actor. His niece, Lily Levi, put it this way: "Not a chair was tall enough, not a bed was long enough, not a table was high enough." The near constant lack of creature comforts, not to mention unlikelihood of finding well-fitting clothes in whatever town he happened to be in, led him back to Shippingport once again, this time with enough money in pocket to venture into business, which eventually included the Big Gun Tavern. And soon enough, lo and behold, here was that funny-looking English writer, the one who looked more like a riverboat high roller than a supposed champion of the poor. Of course, you already know what happened between Dickens and Porter during their short encounter. What you do not know, however, is that Mr. Dickens's published encounter with the Kentucky Giant found its way to history's most enterprising showman, P.T. Barnum. Upon learning of this incredible man, Barnum contacted the Kentucky Giant with an offer. Now, people will tell you that Barnum offered Porter a role in his traveling circus, but at this point in time, the mid-1840s, Barnum was decades from his first circus. At this point, Barnum was running his American Museum in the heart of New York City. It was a huge attraction filled with animals, lecture halls, and many outright lies. like the famous Fiji mermaid. This was not a mermaid at all, but a rather grotesque creation, with the torso of a monkey stitched to the tail of a fish. Barnum was a moneymaker first and foremost, and he softened lies like these by calling them humbugs. He believed people wanted to be fooled sometimes. With that same mindset, he was perfectly okay with having living people on display in his museum as attractions. These might include people from far-off lands, or people like Tom Thumb, who, as an adult, stood just over 3 feet tall. This was exploitative of these people, and it feels very uncomfortable to consider today. Perhaps that's the way Jim Porter felt at the time as well, because when Barnum offered him a spot in the museum, Porter declined. He'd already had his fill of wide eyes and fingers pointed. Plus, he was not just a business owner, but likely the most famous man for 1,000 miles. There was plenty of opportunity for him in Kentucky. In 1836, Big Jim Porter opened his first tavern. Named the Lone Star, the business was a tremendous success, encouraging Jim to open an even larger tavern on Front Street in 1848. Much like its owner, the second tavern was massive. 3 stories tall with 18 rooms and 12-foot ceilings above 10-foot doors. And at long last, there was even furniture custom-made with the Kentucky Giant in mind. And the name of this remarkable establishment, you might be asking? The Big Gun Tavern, so named after an 8-foot hunting rifle of Porter's that once hung over the bar. Now, thanks to our friends at the Filson Historical Society, it sits on display in the Cool Kentucky exhibit at the Fraser History Museum. Stories endure today that as the bourbon flowed and the ale was poured, patrons would often ask Jim to take down the half-gun, half-cannon mounted on the wall and fire off a shot or two. And by most accounts, he was willing to oblige. Shouldering the rifle as if it was a Red Ryder, Porter was both revered and cheered, a living legend in the town of Portland, beloved by all. Even so, there is a season for everything. As with most of Portland, times would sour for Porter and tavern alike. Trains began replacing steamboats, bringing in fewer visitors and less money to the town. The Big Gun Tavern was soon out of business, leaving Porter to ponder the next stage of his life. Alas, it would never come. Big Jim died not long after, likely due to complications from acromegaly, found lying in his bed just before breakfast. The following day, the Louisville Daily Courier would write that his death will be universally deplored. He was a useful citizen, an honest man, and fulfilled, with fidelity, all the duties and responsibilities of his life, alike to his fellow men and country. Jim Porter was 48 years old. His astonishing yet peculiar story does not end there, however, as there was still the matter of his burial to contend with. Much like in life, Jim's death presented a myriad of issues, most notably the size of his coffin, specially crafted at 9 feet long. The rear doors of the horse-drawn hearse had to be tied shut to keep Jim's casket from falling out as the procession made its way to Cave Hill Cemetery. Placed in his family's vault, the Kentucky Giant remained a spectacle even in death, as visitors would travel from far and wide to peer into the vault, hoping to glance Porter's colossal casket next to the much smaller coffins keeping him company. Eventually, the vault fell into disrepair, unceremoniously torn down less than 50 years after Jim's passing. Today, there is an ironically small concrete marker on a hillside facing the lake commemorating his extraordinary life. You can go visit him, as so many did during his lifetime. All the same, Jim Porter lives on. Not just in history books, but in the undefinable spirit of Kentuckians everywhere. A born performer who rejected the limelight, a once jockey, eventual giant, too large to build barrels, yet conveniently sized to drive carriages. He inspired English writers and future bar owners. Perhaps you remember Jim Porter's Good Time Emporium, named in his honor here in Louisville. Jim Porter was many, many things. But more than anything, he is Kentucky through and through, and we are fortunate to claim him as our own.
It was 1888, and Martin Van Buren Bates, so named after America's 8th president, had seen much better days. His wife and perfect companion, Anna, had tragically died of heart failure, just 1 day shy of her 42nd birthday. Compounding the sadness and the stress of the loss were the problems surrounding Anna's burial. Finding an appropriate coffin for his beloved had proven difficult, delaying both the funeral and Martin's time to grieve. The loss made him consider his own mortality, and as a result, Martin saw the wisdom in finding a coffin of his own for whenever that time came. But a casket would not be easily found for a man like Bates. One would have to be made because this widower, Martin Van Buren Bates, was a colossal specimen, a true gargantuan of a man who stood 7 feet 9 inches tall. And his dearly departed wife, Anna, she had been even taller. It was common to name children after political leaders in America's early days. Martin Van Buren Bates was born in 1837, the first year in the Oval Office for his namesake, a president who was often called the Little Magician. Ironic, considering the eventual size of baby Martin. It was in the mountainous region of Letcher County, Kentucky, surrounded by the natural wonders of Appalachia, where Martin drew his first breath. Before long, the youngest of the 12 Bates children would tower over the rest of the family. By age 12, young Martin was a sight to behold, 6 feet and 300 pounds of Appalachian brawn. Yet Sarah, his mother, forbade him from working on the farm, believing an ever-growing Martin, with his elongated limbs, to be far too delicate. If she had only known what the future held for her youngest, Sarah may have been far less cautious. It was a strange notion, you might think, but a son is always his mother's baby boy, regardless of size or stature. In stark contrast were Martin's students. After graduating from Emory and Henry College, he was drawn to teaching, where in early adulthood he towered over the students. By all accounts, he thoroughly enjoyed the profession and was admired and adored by those he taught. That's not to say that Bates was thought of as a pushover. His students knew where to draw the line and were careful not to poke the bear. One former student would say, years later, "Big Boy Bates was a fellow none of us boys ever sassed. We didn't dare. Why, he was so big his voice just sort of rumbled, like a bull bellowing." So, while the Kentucky River Giant, as he became known, may have been a gentle soul, his mountainous size certainly encouraged others to mind their P's and Q's. Nonetheless, the time soon came to trade pen for sword. A civil war stirred between countrymen and brothers, and Bates felt a duty to join the Confederate cause. Make no mistake, his reasoning was neither just nor flattering. He would write that, as a son of a slave owner, with the principle of states' rights predominating within me, I felt it my duty to tender my services in defense of what I believed was right. Unfortunately, history is full of larger-than-life figures, with often appalling convictions. But his size and leadership were undeniable. Bates shot up the ranks, swiftly promoted to lieutenant and then captain. And what a fearsome sight he must have been, standing head, neck, and shoulders over friend and foe alike. Indeed, one Union soldier would describe Bates as large enough for 5 men with the fight of 50. War is hell enough without giants roaming the battlefield, but blades and bullets pierce the flesh of Davids and Goliaths alike. A lesson learned all too well by Bates, who was injured while fighting at the Cumberland Gap. Union soldiers captured the Kentucky River Giant, imprisoning him at Ohio's Camp Chase. But Bates was not one to be kept captive. he managed to escape soon after, somehow unseen. Martin set his sights both on home and on returning to the classroom, 1 foot in front of the other, in boots so large you could have filled each one with a bushel of corn, or so it was said. He did not get far before fate intervened. Approaching Cincinnati, Bates encountered a most unusual sight: a traveling circus with animals and acrobats, big tents, and big dreamers. He recognized the opportunity that this gave a man like him. Rather than teaching again, Bates decided to join John Robinson's circus as a sideshow attraction, and a rather imposing one at that. Strangely enough, he was not the first from his family to bring his talents to the big top. Bates's nephew, John Wright, had also joined the same circus as a marksman, amazing audiences across the Midwest by shooting targets astride his galloping horse. Wright's aim was truly legendary, helping him to become the most famous U.S. Marshal ever from Eastern Kentucky. For the next 5 years, the circus carried Martin across North America. That is, until a chance encounter turned his larger-than-life life upside down. It was at a party in New Jersey where perhaps the most astonishing piece of life's puzzle fell into place. His promoter introduced him to Anna Swan. For the rare occasion in his life, Martin looked up. And when he did, he saw love. Actual, bona fide, put a ring on it, True love, looking right back down. Incredibly, Anna's story is every bit as fascinating as Martin's. You see, Anna was rather tall herself. Known as the Giantess Girl from Nova Scotia, she stood 7 feet 11 inches, 2 inches taller than Bates. At 16, she began working for P.T. Barnum's American Museum in New York City, eventually earning $1,000 a month, or roughly $20,000 today. When the museum famously caught fire in 1865, Anna had to be rescued before the building burned to the ground. Trapped by her size and the confines of the collapsing building, Anna was lowered from a 3rd-story window by 18 men. Before the fire, Anna was often seen traveling through the city in a carriage pulled by Clydesdales. Now she was on the roads of the country at large, earning a living much like Martin. Quickly for Bates, other things lost importance, for Anna had stolen his heart. Clearly the pair were meant for one another, and marriage seemed all but inevitable. Of course, theirs would not just be any wedding, but a celebration as grand and majestic as the engaged couple. The highly publicized union was held at London's legendary St. Martin-in-the-Fields, and the event drew thousands. And though many were present for the spectacle, even more were in attendance simply because they adored the two good-natured and naturally great bride and groom. One of those admirers was none other than Queen Victoria herself. The British monarch gave Anna the beautiful satin gown she wore, along with a diamond ring. And to Martin, she gave an engraved pocket watch as large as a tea saucer. The couple were no strangers to the Queen. Martin and Anna had appeared at Buckingham Palace just 2 weeks before the wedding, the first of several visits. In the days that followed, they made the rounds with other royalty: Duke Vladimir of Russia, the Prince of Wales, Prince John of Luxembourg would each request a private reception with the newlywed titans. Within the year, husband and wife returned from Europe, settling in the small rural town of Seville, Ohio. Here they knew that if they really wanted to stretch out, they'd need a very large home. After purchasing a 130-acre farm, construction began on what locals soon referred to as the house that giants built. A cavernous homestead boasting 14-foot ceilings, oversized furniture designed at long last with Martin and Anna's comfort in mind. Soon enough, they were throwing raucous parties for friends and neighbors, many of whom would have been quite amused by the couple's new pet monkey, Buttons. But much like today, building a house is a costly endeavor, especially one built with giants in mind. So in 1878, to pay their growing bills, husband and wife made their return to the big top and the big lights, this time joining the W.W. Cole Circus. At a combined 16 feet and 900 pounds, Martin and Anna were billed as the largest married couple in the world, once again reigniting their immense popularity. It seemed the whole of Martin and Anna was truly greater than the sum of its parts. And now, with a child on the way, this seemed truer still. Unfortunately, Anna's child would die during childbirth. Measuring 28 inches in length and weighing 23 pounds, the boy's size was only exceeded by his parents' sorrow. Given the name Babe by his grief-stricken parents, the child remains the largest newborn ever recorded in the Guinness Book of World Records. And so, after just 2 years, the couple once again returned home to Seville to live out the rest of their days and perhaps try for another child. The universe, though, had other designs, dreadful and dark. Anna Swan Bates did not survive the decade, dying in her sleep from heart failure at 41. Preparations, bleak and somber, followed. When Martin ordered Anna's casket from a manufacturer in Cleveland, the coffin maker became convinced that there had been a mistake with the provided measurements. He couldn't imagine anyone needing a coffin so large, so a smaller coffin was delivered. Returned to sender. It would take another 3 days for the correct coffin to arrive. Following the funeral, the house that Giants built was sold and eventually destroyed. Martin moved into a much smaller home closer to town to start anew. He remarried the following year, this time to a woman of more common stature, Annette LaVaughn Weatherby, and they were married for 3 decades until Martin's passing. Annette herself would live until 1940. For the rest of his days, Martin kept his own coffin. The enormous casket, made of oak and lined with copper, would be stored in a nearby barn for decades. It's not that he was waiting for death. He simply didn't want anyone else to have to go through what he had to when trying to bury Anna. As his days in the limelight faded, Martin forged on, living an incredible 33 more years before passing in 1919 due to kidney inflammation. This makes Martin Van Buren Bates the tallest known person to live past 80, though one wonders if he would have traded any of those years to have spent more time with Anna.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Kentucky Wide.
This episode was written by Jason Berkowitz.
Production and music by Mick Sullivan.
Make sure to subscribe or follow so you can join us in a few weeks when we'll focus on some Civil War stories, including a Union general who was murdered in the Galt House by Jefferson Davis. But not that Jefferson Davis.
We'll also hear about Camp Nelson and its connection to the poetry of Frank X. Walker. Until then, we invite you to come see us at the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, Kentucky.
I'm Mick.
And I'm Sarah.
And this has been Kentucky Wide,
a production of the Fraser History Museum.